What I hope to do today is just talk a little bit about the problem as AQMD sees it and as everyone sees it in the basin, then a little bit about mitigation. Paul talked about mitigation for schools, but it's kind of complicated. No one has a lot of good ideas about mitigation right now. What can we do to reduce these exposures of people living next to roadways? And so this is the problem, and these types of developments are still going in where right next to a roadway there may be a small sound wall, but in this case there's a second-story residences right next to the road, and this is within 20, 30 feet of a road. We're still getting large new developments right next to freeways, even though the evidence has been out there for 10 years or more about what these near roadway exposures can do and what kind of pollutants are coming off the cars. And then this is kind of our poster child for exposures, the Hudson Elementary in West Long Beach. The playground of that school where kids are playing for every recess and lunch is literally feet from the Terminal Island Freeway, which is mostly diesel trucks coming from the port area, and then a rail line right on the other side. So despite the evidence, we're still getting proposals for projects that are doing the same thing. This is a proposed a rail transfer facility where trucks would bring cargo containers from the ports and then transfer them to rail to be taken across the country. And again, the proposal is to put this right next to Hudson School, right next to a large high school. And right now it's going through kind of the approval process, the secret process. But again, we're still getting these types of proposals that AQMD is asked to evaluate. I won't have to go through this. John did a good job of telling you all of the health evidence linking just living next to a roadway to health effects. And this is not even specific to any type of pollutant, but ultrafines are really becoming what people think is the causal agent in a lot of these different health effects by living next to a roadway. And it's not a small problem in the basin. This is a 1 mile buffer. And you saw from Suzanne that at certain times a day the plume from the freeways for ultrafines and other pollutants can go out to 1 mile or more. This is a 1 mile buffer just around our freeways, not including a lot of our busy roadways in Southern California. You see it almost covers half the basin. This is in meters. 1,500 meters is about a mile. So about half of us in Southern California live within 1 mile of a busy roadway, and when you get to those really close distances, 100 meters or 500 meters, it's still a very large number, 4%, 100 meters, almost 20% within 500 meters. So it's not just a few people that are stuck next to a roadway, it's a large fraction of the population. A lot of people say, well, how come you're not monitoring next to these roadways? Right now, EPA has no requirements for near roadway monitoring for PM. And if they did, and they might very soon, it would be for what everyone said was for PM mass. And these ultrafine particles do not contribute very much to the mass. While you can get a factor of 10 or 20 or 30 times higher ultrafine particle numbers next to a freeway, you might only get about 5% more of what we would call PM mass. And that's what's regulated right now. In fact, we're not supposed to locate our monitors next to these freeways because these monitors are set up for things like PM and ozone, and we're trying to get regional levels of pollutants, not local. So they're actually guidelines to stay away from these sources so it doesn't influence your measurements. However, EPA has kind of started changing their tune in the last few years. There are now near roadway monitoring requirements for NO2 as part of the NO2 standard. Carbon monoxide is about to get finalized, if it hasn't been already, where we're going to have to measure carbon monoxide next to roadways. And they're just reconsidering their PM regulations, and the thought is that they're going to have some near roadway requirements for PM as well. But again, it won't be for ultrafine particles, it'll be for PM 2.5 or PM 10. And again, I guess I didn't pull all the data out. You've seen this before in Suzanne's talk. This is just showing you the large increase in certain pollutants next to a freeway and a very small increase in particle mass, maybe 5 or 10%. And then at certain times a day, this influence can go out to 1,500 meters or more over a mile, depending on the time of day. Suzanne covered that. And AQMD has done similar studies that Suzanne has done and other people at UCLA has done. This is a study that we're just finalizing now. A final report should be issued within the next couple weeks, and if you contact me, I can get that to you, where we measure next to the 710 freeway a variety of pollutants, air toxics, traditional pollutants like PM, lead, but also ultrafine particles. So that we're just about done getting that report finalized. I don't have any data here, but just wanted to put a little plug in for that. But then looking at mitigation measures. Obviously, the best way to avoid these exposures is to lower those on-road emissions. And you can either lower them through less traffic, which is better for a lot of, probably the best thing to do. But if you are going to have the traffic, we need to make sure that the emissions, the tailpipe emissions of those on-road vehicles are as low as possible. AQMD doesn't have authority over on-road emissions. That lies with the state, the California Air Resources Board, or the federal government. However, we do our best to convince the state and the federal government that they need to tighten their standards. Right now the standards, there are no standards for ultrafine. Europe is just implementing some standards for ultrafine particles, but the US does not have any standards for ultrafine. So one of the things we'd like to see is if they have these high standards, they need to make sure that some of the controls they're putting on tailpipe emissions will also decrease ultrafine emissions. In some cases, they can actually increase ultrafine emissions if you reduce the mass of particles. So we need to make sure that whatever controls are going on, they're actually tested to make sure ultrafines aren't increased. Another obvious thing, and Paul talked about that in some of the land use policies, is buffer zones, whether it's 500 feet or 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet. There's really probably should not be development going in right next to these busy freeways or busy roadways. But again, with SB 375 and the sustainable community strategies, there's been a push for compact development and building high rises and mixed use development, and they tend to go right next to freeways where people would have maybe even quicker access to the freeway, so they don't have to commute so far. So the suburban development in LA that had people spread out, it caused all this extra traffic, but in some ways it reduced exposures to some of the compared to some of the more urban areas of the country that develop differently, like New York. Again, lowering traffic is important, and congestion, the stop-and-go traffic tends to be one of the increased ultrafine particles, more than just smooth driving. Electrification, I have rail electrification here, but also because it's not just next to busy roadways you get these exposures, it's next to rail yards, it's next to rail lines. So electrifying those types of sources, whether it's rail or even on-road at this point, would definitely help. And then we've done some work on indoor particle filtration and sound walls and different barriers or roadside features that might mitigate exposures, and I'll talk a tiny bit about that. Again, when I mentioned electric rail, it seems like a pipe dream in Southern California that we can have all these rail lines that we have all electric, especially for cargo. There is a lot of electric, there used to be a lot of electric passenger railways in the US, but for cargo there's hardly any. But in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, in Europe and in Asia, there's plenty of electric rail just for cargo. And all over the world they have this, and especially in urban areas. I was in Osaka a couple years ago, and they have a rail yard transfer facility right smack in the middle of downtown, which you think would be a horrible land use, but it's all electrified. There's very few emissions. So we've done some work on classroom filtration because people keep asking us, like LAUSD, about these mitigation measures that they mention in their policy. So how can we do that? So we've done some pilot studies and now have some implementation studies on installing high efficiency filtration in classrooms, and we've gotten some very good results from that. This is just some data. If you look at the gray bars, this is with the old filter, with the old kind of standard filter that schools tend to use, and then with our high efficiency filter, we get much more removal efficiency, in this case of black carbon, but it also works for ultrafine particles. So we can get up to 80 or 90% removal of black carbon in the classroom versus around 10% with the old types of filters. They're more expensive. These filters might cost $100 each instead of $6 each or $4 each for the old filters, but they tend to last longer actually, and we're doing a lot of work down in the Long Beach area, Long Beach, San Pedro, Wilmington. We have multi-million-dollar implementation studies where we're doing hundreds of classrooms. We also have a project in Boyle Heights and San Bernardino doing the same thing.
Can you really deal with the ultrafine?
Yeah, it filters out the ultrafines.
Really?
Yeah.
Of course it does. It should.
Well, the traditional filters aren't. Don't do it
Filter
very
out
well.
the vapors that turn into particles.
No, they don't. Any solid particle they will filter out. But we've done particle number measurements inside the classroom, And inside the classroom, they're very, very low, or we get the 90% reduction. So we haven't seen the reformation of ultrafine particles, which really shouldn't happen because the temperature conditions haven't changed so much from the filter to the classroom. And then effects of barriers. There's been a lot of talk about sound walls. Do sound walls help? And should sound walls be higher or further away? Do they help the problem? There's been a lot of work done at EPA. This is from one of their studies where this is in North Carolina. There's a freeway here, and here's a noise barrier or a sound wall. And you can see behind the sound wall you get some lower numbers, in this case of ultrafines, but when the sound wall is not there, you get some higher numbers. And there's been lots of studies and with mixed results on this, and it really depends on the configuration of the freeway. In some cases, people have found that even though it might lower concentrations here, if these guys would have went out further, they'd actually find some higher concentrations further away from the freeway, because you're just delaying when kind of this plume of pollutants will come back down to the ground. So what is AQMD doing in this area? Again, our primary focus has to be and has been, these regional pollutants like PM and ozone and the things that LA is known for being out of attainment of standards. But we also deal with air toxics, and we also deal with emerging issues like this. So again, we're always promoting lower on-road emissions to the extent we can with tighter California and federal standards. We do a lot of technology development and demonstration and implementation. We run a lot of programs incentivizing taking the dirtiest vehicles off the roads, replacing the dirty diesel trucks with natural gas, things like that. And we also do a lot of work into clean fuels. What we're working on right now is we're required by the federal government to have a plan to meet the clean air standards by a certain date in the future, and it's called a SIP, or a State Implementation Plan. But our Southern California piece of that we call the AQMP, or the Air Quality Management Plan. So we're just kicking that off now, and although there's no SIP requirement for near roadway exposures at this point, or for ultrafines, we're going to devote a chapter, or at least half a chapter, on this near roadway exposure issue in ultrafines. We're about to release that I-710 study report. I've also just kicked off funding for 3 different research projects evaluating these mitigation measures, whether it's sound walls, different configurations of sound walls, maybe some active types of measures that could be taken next to a freeway, as well as filtration, and to just see the feasibility and effectiveness of different types of mitigation that could be taken for at least existing developments or existing schools that are being subject to this. And then we have MATES 4. This is a 4th installment of a region-wide air toxics measurement and modeling study. MATES 3 was back from 2004 to 2006, so we're just in the discussion phases for our MATES 4 study. It'll be a little bit different than before, which before kind of focused on the traditional air toxics. This time we're really going to focus more on ultrafines and black carbon. Black carbon is an indicator of diesel PM. And we're going to really look at near-source exposures and try to map out some of these exposures with measurements, whether it's a rail yard, whether it's a busy freeway, whether it's the ports or an airport, a warehouse or something like all these types of diesel sources and ultrafine sources to really see what those community-level exposures are in multiple locations of the basin. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay.